The purpose of this video is to walk you through various excerpts from the Federalist Papers 47, 48, and 59. Your assignment was to take what James Madison, one of the most educated Americans of his day, wrote and translate them into understandable modern English. Before we get started, it would be helpful to remind ourselves what he was exactly trying to do. The Federalist Papers were essays written by Madison, Alexander Hamilton, and John Jay to explain the various provisions of the new Constitution and to convince New Yorkers to support its ratification. So, just to be clear, the authors of the Federalist Papers were trying to explain a completely new kind of government, one with many new features that had never been seen before in history, to people who had only ever experienced monarchy and the Articles of Confederation, which were relatively simple to understand. A lot of these features, these features in the new Constitution are now over 200 years old and pretty familiar to us, but they needed a lot of explaining back then because they'd never been tried before. So part of our struggle today to understand Madison is not only the language he used, but sometimes that he's explaining things that would be obvious to us if we could just understand what he's saying. So here are excerpts from Federalist Papers translated into English. It's going to be pretty exciting, so if you have to go to the bathroom, maybe now is the time because, we don't want any accidents along the way. This is the assignment that we're going over the answers to. You don't have to have it in front of you. The questions and the answers are all in this video. It's better if you've already tried to do it yourself, but also not necessary. Also, before we get started, it might be nice to have a few of the terms that Madison used frequently well in mind, like the word tyranny. Tyranny is the arbitrary or unrestrained exercise of power. It was tyranny that we were trying to get rid of when we fought the British. King George III is a tyrant. And when we were constructing the government that was going to be in effect in America, we very much wanted to avoid any sort of return of tyranny. Madison uses the word departments, where we would use the word branches today. So when he says departments, he's meaning the branches like legislative, executive, and judicial. The word republic or representative republic or republican government, they all mean representative democracy without a king. So, we don't use the word republic much anymore, but representative democracy is what he's talking about. The executive magistracy or magistrate is just anyone kind of in general whose job it is to enforce the law, any sort of government official. Encroachment is intruding upon or stealing away someone's territory or authority, and usurp and usurpation has pretty much the same meaning, taking someone's position or power illegally. Excerpt A says, the accumulation of all powers, legislative, executive, and judiciary, in the same hands, whether of one, a few, or many, and whether hereditary, self-appointed, or elective, may justly be pronounced the very definition of tyranny. This excerpt is from Federalist 47, and here Madison is saying that tyranny is what you get if you ever combine all three powers of government, legislative, executive, and judicial, when they are gathered together in the hands of one or a few people. And it doesn't matter how they got the power, whether it was inherited or obtained by force or by election, no matter how they get it, putting all that power into one set of hands is asking for tyranny. That was Montesquieu's way to bring up the concept of separation of powers, which of course was the brainchild of the political author Montesquieu, which most educated Americans at that time had read and understood. But because the Constitution included lots of overlapping powers, as part of the system of checks and balances, Madison felt he had to explain why those complicated interactions between the branches existed in the Constitution. And so this excerpt says Montesquieu did not mean that these departments ought to have no partial agency in or no control over the acts of the other. What he was getting at was that Montesquieu said, yes, separate the branches, separate the powers. But he had to point out that Montesquieu never said that the three branches had to be completely separate from each other. He was saying that it's okay if the three branches have certain control over or authority over the other branches, that's not violating what Montesquieu said. That's actually consistent with what Montesquieu said. And to further bolster his point, he says, if we look into the constitutions of the several states, we find that there is not a single instance in which the several departments have been kept absolutely separate and distinct. So, in case it's news to you, remember the states were sovereign countries before the Constitution was written. So they each had constitutions of their own. And in those constitutions, there was no example, Madison's pointing out here, there were no examples where the three branches were completely separate from each other. In all state governments, there were examples of the branches being involved in each other's powers. So he's just kind of laying the groundwork for the upcoming discussion about checks and balances. In Excerpt D, in a representative republic where the executive magistracy is carefully limited and where the legislative is exercised by an assembly, it is against the enterprising ambition of this department that the people ought to indulge all their jealousy and exhaust all their precautions. So here he's pointing out that in a representative democracy, like the one we were trying to create, and where the executive branch has been carefully limited in its powers, then it's the legislative branch, the possible ambitions of the legislative branch that the people need to take precautions about. It's possible that if the executive branch has been limited in its powers, then it's possible that it's the legislative branch is the one that's going to get greedy and try to grab up all the power. So that's the branch you have to be careful about. And that's so in the Constitution, that's the branch that you need to build in limits or powers over the legislative branch held by the other branches. In Excerpt E, we find Madison talking about why the legislative branch is so powerful. As the legislative department alone has access to the pockets of the people, that's taxes, and has in some constitutions full discretion and in all a prevailing influence over the pecuniary rewards of those who fill the other departments. Pecuniary means financial. So the legislative branch not only has access to tax money, the power to tax, but it also has discretion or power over the financial rewards of those who fill the other departments, meaning the salaries. The legislative branch controls the salaries of those who work in the other branches. So a dependence is thus created in the latter. So that means the people who are being paid as in the executive branch or the judicial branch, they depend for their salary. They depend on the legislative branch, which gives the possibility of encroachments to the legislative branch. Encroachments means the act of taking their power, threatening them in some way, or blackmailing them in some way, or bribing them in some way. So the legislative branch, because of its power over the money, its power over the purse, its control over the salaries of the people in the other branches, it has a lot of power. So it needs to be blocked by the other branches. And now we come to Federalist 51, arguably one of the 2 or 3 most important Federalist Papers, and definitely one of the 9 documents that the College Board expects you to have a good handle on going into the AP exam. So here's a very famous passage from the Federalist 51. But the great security against a gradual concentration of the several powers in the same department consists in giving to those who administer each department the necessary constitutional means and personal motives to resist encroachments of the others. And then comes probably the most famous 7 words in the entire body of all the Federalist Papers. Ambition must be made to counteract ambition. So let's go to the next slide. What he was saying was that to guard against too much power being concentrated in one branch, we need to give each branch some sort of power and a reason to defend itself, some sort of power over the other branches so that each branch can defend itself from the other branches. We need to create a system in which ambitious people who are greedy for power make sure they all have a way to fight off all the other ambitious, power-hungry people in government. What Madison is doing here is explaining the purpose behind the Constitution's system of checks and balances. And the reason that the phrase ambition must be made to counteract ambition, the reason that's so famous is because it very succinctly summarizes the whole purpose of the complicated system of checks and balances. Ambition must counteract ambition. The power-hungry, ambitious people in each branch have a way to stop the ambitious, power-hungry people in all the other branches. And they keep each other in check. They keep blocking each other from grabbing too much power from the other branches. Ambition must be made to counteract ambition. Checks and balances in a nutshell. If those last 7 words are the most famous single sentence in all the Federalist Papers, then this passage, this paragraph here, might be the most famous passage in the Federalist Papers. If men were angels, no government would be necessary. If angels were to govern men, neither external nor internal controls on government would be necessary. In framing a government which is to be administered by men over men, the great difficulty lies in this. You must first enable the government to control the governed, and in the next place, oblige it to control itself. Madison is trying to explain how the Constitution just might be the solution to one of mankind's most enduring problems. How do you have a government with enough power to govern, but not too much, so that it imposes tyranny on the people it's trying to govern? So to translate, if men were angels, means if people were perfect, then we wouldn't need government. And then if angels governed over us, if perfect people ran the government, we wouldn't have to worry about a government abusing its power. But we have to somehow create a government that's composed of people that has to have enough power to govern people. So it has to have enough power to control the people, but we also have to build in a way for the government to control itself. As I said before, this pretty much sums up the dilemma that all human beings have faced throughout history. How do you construct a government that is powerful enough to do its job, but is not so powerful that it gets carried away and abuses the rights of the citizens? Our Constitution, we thought, and we still have reason to believe today even, that we think we kind of figured out the solution of that. And that's a complicated system of checks and balances that tries to keep each branch, each department of power of government in its place. In Excerpt H, also in Federalist 51, Madison goes on to say, in Republican government, the legislative authority necessarily predominates. The remedy for this inconveniency is to divide the legislature into different branches, and to render them, by different modes of election and different principles of action, as little connected with each other as the nature of their common functions and their common dependence on the society will admit. First thing I want to point out here is that the word Republican is not capitalized. It does not mean the Republican Party because it didn't exist then. And it's not used here as a proper noun. Republican just means characteristic of a republic. So he's just saying in a representative democracy. And then he points out something that doesn't make a whole lot of sense to us in modern America, because we think of the president as being the most powerful person or branch in our country, in our government. But he's pointing out back then that was not the attitude. The attitude back then was that the Congress was the one that had the most power, and he's pointing out that maybe it's a good decision to break Congress into 2 pieces to weaken it. We'll talk about that in the next slide. Since the legislative branch is naturally the most powerful branch in a democracy like ours, it's a smart thing to reduce its power by dividing it into 2 parts, 2 chambers, 2 houses. It said branches on the previous slide, but we would say, 2 houses. And have them elected differently, like the House is elected by the people, and back then the Senate was elected by state legislatures. In other words, to keep that legislative branch from becoming too powerful, separated its powers into 2 parts, and then create a system of checks and balances within the legislative branch in order to limit its ability to possibly abuse its power and abuse our rights. Because, to pass a law, it has to go through both chambers. So if the House wants something done, the Senate can stop the House. If the Senate wants something done, the House can stop the Senate. Checks and balances even within the legislative branch. There is no excerpt I because there is no I in government. This is my way of pointing out that the powers of government are supposed to be used for the good of the people in general, and not for the benefit of those who govern. No I in government. Excerpt J says it may even be necessary to guard against dangerous encroachments by still further precautions. As the weight of the legislative authority requires that it should be thus divided, the weakness of the executive may require, on the other hand, that it should be fortified. An absolute negative on the legislature appears at first view to be the natural defense with which the executive magistrate should be armed. What he's saying is that dividing Congress into two chambers might not be enough. We have to guard against legislative branches' possible abuse of power in additional ways. So, in addition to dividing the branch into two chambers, we should also give the executive branch an additional power, an absolute negative or veto power over the laws that it passes. So that explains why they put the presidential veto power in the Constitution. But I would also point out that in reality, the Constitution does not make this power absolute, because Congress can, on occasion, rarely, but can, override that absolute veto power, which is not absolute, with a 2/3 vote of both houses. And finally, Excerpt K. In a single republic, all the power surrendered by the people is submitted to the administration of a single government. Single republic, single government. He's talking about a unitary government with only one national government and no subnational governments. And the usurpations are guarded against by a division of the government into distinct and separate departments. So you could have separation of powers work okay in a unitary government, but more importantly, in our system, in the compound Republic of America, that what he's referring to there is a federal system where there's a national government and states with their own powers. The power surrendered by the people is first divided between two distinct governments. That's the national government and state governments. And then the portion allotted to each subdivided among distinct and separate departments. So at the national government, there's 3 branches fighting each other for power. And in state governments, there are 3 branches also fighting each other for power. Hence, a double security arises to the rights of the people. The different governments will control each other at the same time that each will be controlled by itself. Again, a statement of checks and balances at both levels of government. So just to summarize, to explain more clearly, in a country with one government, a unitary system, the government can be divided into branches in order to protect the people from the government. In a compound or federal republic like America, the rights of the people are even better protected by dividing up the government 2 ways. First into levels, national and state governments, and then dividing both of those levels of governments into different branches. In this way, checks and balances not only works between branches, but between the levels of government as well, because the national government can sometimes stop states from doing certain things. Sometimes states can stop national government from doing certain things. All of this checking and balancing going on between branches and levels of government gives more security to the people's rights and freedoms. I hope you have now a better understanding of those excerpts from the Federalist Papers, and good luck on the test.